Back in 1996, I was lucky enough to experience Super Mario 64 at launch. The game was unlike anything I had ever played before. From the moment Mario's big head popped on the screen, it was clear this was the future of gaming. The leap from 2D to 3D was a massive change. Instead of running from left to right, you had full control over Mario in a large open world. It felt huge, packed with secrets, challenges, and interactive environments that encouraged exploration in a way no other game had before. From sliding down the snowy slopes of Cool Mountain to dodging fireballs in lethal lava land, every stage had its own atmosphere, its own charm. For the time, the game wasn't just impressive, it was mind-blowing. Now, not every 3D platformer from that era has aged gracefully, but Super Mario 64, the granddaddy of them all, still holds up surprisingly well. Sure, the camera control and Mario's movement feel a little stiff by today's standards, but spend a little time with them and it all clicks. Because of its legacy, Super Mario 64 has seen plenty of re-releases, both official and fan-made. But what's the best way to play today? That's what I set out to figure out. Not to declare a definitive version, but to find out which option is best depending on what you're looking for. Let's check out a bunch of different ways you could revisit this classic today.
Hello!
Alright, let's start at the beginning. The way most of us first played Super Mario 64, on an original Nintendo 64 console. There's something undeniably authentic about playing on original hardware. It's exactly the way the game was meant to be played, sitting in front of that beautiful console, bathed in the soft glow of a CRT, gripping that three-pronged controller, which somehow feels way smaller and a lot less comfortable than it did 30 years ago. It all comes together to recreate that nostalgic magic. It's as close as you can get to stepping back in time. But as much as I love the authenticity, the original setup isn't the most convenient today. I won't get too deep into it here, since I already covered the practicality of buying and setting up retro hardware in my last video, but the N64 was designed for CRT televisions, those big boxy screens that most people happily got rid of years ago. Bringing one of those back into the house? Yeah, that's a hard sell for most people. Personally, unless you grew up playing Super Mario 64 on a CRT, I don't see much of a reason to go out of your way to track down original hardware, especially if you're just going to hook it up to a modern TV. You'll need adapters, upscalers, and for what? It's expensive, it's a hassle, and by the time you put all that extra effort in, most of the authenticity is already lost. At that point, you might as well look into other options. But if you have the right setup and a working CRT, nothing beats the classic experience. Next, let's take a look at the official ways to play Super Mario 64 today, starting with the Nintendo Switch Online release. This version is included with the Switch Online expansion pack, and it's the same North American release we played back in the day. Out of all the ways to play Super Mario 64, this is by far the most convenient. No setup, no extra hardware, just download it and start playing. But, like with everything, there are trade-offs. Nintendo's history with N64 emulation hasn't exactly been great, but a lot of the complaints feel overblown, at least when it comes to Super Mario 64. I played this game for hundreds of hours back in the 90s and 2000s, and I don't notice half the things that people nitpick online. You've got screaming about small inconsistencies, like how Mario's shadow sits slightly too high on his shoes, or how certain textures look a little different. Yeah, it's not a perfect one-to-one recreation, but it's definitely good enough. There are a few oddities, like visible seams and some textures, but these are purely visual and don't affect gameplay. I've also seen reports of input lag, but after spending hours with this version, I didn't notice any at all. Maybe it depends on which controller you're using. Speaking of which, I highly recommend playing with Nintendo's wireless N64 controller. This thing is a game changer. It's basically a brand new N64 controller with a fresh analog stick, built-in rumble pack, and USB-C charging. The game just feels right when played with this controller. And if you're planning to play a lot of N64 games on Switch, it's worth picking up while Nintendo still offers them. That said, the Switch Online version comes with a cost. You're not just paying for the game, you're paying for a subscription. And N64 games are locked behind the most expensive expansion pack tier. If you're only interested in playing Super Mario 64, it doesn't make much sense to subscribe for just this one game. There's also the issue of digital ownership. Since the game is tied to the Switch Online service, you can only play it for as long as your membership is active. And at some point, Nintendo will shut the service down. And when that happens, this version of Super Mario 64 will be gone. For now though, if all you're looking for is a quick and easy way to play Super Mario 64 without any extra effort, the Switch Online version does the job. In late 2020, Nintendo released Super Mario 3D All-Stars, a collection featuring Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Galaxy. Unlike the Switch Online version, this was a proper retail release, meaning once you bought it, it was yours to keep. No worrying about Nintendo pulling it from their online service. But there was a catch. Nintendo only sold it for a limited time, both physically and digitally, making it harder to find today. Because of that, second-hand prices are higher than your average Switch game. What's really interesting about this version is that it's not just a simple re-release of the N64 version we grew up with. It's based on the Shindo edition, an updated version of the game that was originally released in Japan in 1997. For some quick history, Japan actually got Super Mario 64 a few months before the US version. By the time the game launched in North America, Nintendo had already made some small bug fixes and added more voice clips. A year later, in 1997, Nintendo went back and released an even newer version of the game in Japan, this time with Rumble Pack support. That's the version Nintendo chose to bring to the 3D All-Stars collection. For the Switch release, Nintendo translated this later version into English and gave it some extra polish, higher resolution graphics, sharper UI elements, and cleaned up text that's much easier to read. While it's still running on emulation, it feels like a more refined, premium version of the game. But for some reason, despite being based on the Rumble-enabled version of Mario 64, this release does not support Rumble if you're using the official wireless N64 controller. The Rumble works fine with the Joy-Cons and the Pro controller, but not the one controller that's literally based on the original hardware. Probably just an oversight, but still a weird detail worth mentioning. Despite that, I really like this version of the game. In my opinion, 3D All-Stars is the best official release of Super Mario 64. But at the end of the day, either Switch version is a solid way to experience the game, especially if you just want something easy and accessible. Back in the day, if you didn't have a Nintendo 64, your only other option was to play Super Mario 64 on an emulator. But for a long time, N64 emulation was rough. Unlike older consoles where emulators quickly became reliable, the N64's unique hardware made it difficult to replicate properly. Early N64 emulators used high-level emulation, which focused on mimicking how the N64 functioned rather than how the hardware actually worked. This allowed games to run faster, especially on older computers, but it often led to missing effects, broken textures, and graphical glitches. It was more about making games playable than making them accurate. More precise low-level emulation came later, aiming to replicate the N64's hardware down to the finer details. This method delivered better accuracy, but required much more processing power, making it impractical until more powerful computers became widely available. That said, Super Mario 64 is probably the most emulated N64 game ever, which means it's had a ton of attention over the years. If an emulator supports N64 games at all, you can bet Mario 64 runs on it. Still, emulation isn't perfect. While Mario 64 runs well on most setups, every emulator has its own quirks. And if you're playing on anything other than a high-powered PC, like a handheld device or an older laptop, or something like a Raspberry Pi, things get more complicated. The more accurate an emulator is, the more demanding it is on hardware. So if your system isn't up to the task, you're either dealing with slowdown and performance issues, or using an outdated, less accurate version that comes with its own set of problems. And of course, just like with any other unofficial way to play the game, emulation requires you to provide a ROM file. If you want to stay on the legal side, that means dumping your own cartridge, which adds an extra step before you can even get started. So while emulation is one of the most flexible ways to play Super Mario 64 today, it still has its limits. It's a great option, but not a flawless experience. But what if you didn't have to emulate the game at all?
It's me, Mario!
In 2019, a group of Super Mario 64 fans reverse engineered the game's original ROM, converting it into human-readable C source code. With that code publicly available, the community got to work creating some of the most impressive ways to experience Super Mario 64. Ever played Mario 64 in a web browser? That exists now. There are now fully playable native versions across multiple platforms, each with their own unique enhancements. But the PC port is where things really get interesting. This version runs the game natively, meaning it doesn't rely on N64 emulation at all. Because of that, it can take full advantage of modern hardware, offering features like 4K widescreen support, 60 frames per second, higher quality models, online co-op, and even ray tracing. Remember those 3D renders Nintendo used on all the advertising for Super Mario 64? Like on the box art? There's a project called Super Mario 64 Render 96 that aims to recreate that look in-game, giving Mario and everything else a higher detail, pre-rendered appearance. Crazy. Check out the Render 96 YouTube channel. Now, I haven't tried every version, but I've spent a lot of time with Super Mario 64 Plus, which stays close to the original, but refines the experience with a better frame rate, widescreen support, improved camera controls, and more responsive movement. It feels like a proper remaster. The same game we all know and love, just way smoother and more modern. And since these PC ports don't rely on emulating N64 hardware, they run natively, meaning fewer glitches, better performance, and more stability compared to traditional emulation. Legally though, there's still a catch. These ports don't include Nintendo's assets or original game code. Instead, they require a ROM file that you provide, which is used during installation to compile the game. So just like with emulation, if you want to do things the legal way, you'll need to rip your own cartridge. So nowadays, there are more ways than ever to experience Super Mario 64, and each one comes with its own trade-offs. If you're after the most authentic experience, playing on an original N64 with a CRT is as close as you'll ever get to reliving 1996. For a more convenient approach, the Nintendo Switch offers two official ways to play: the Switch Online Expansion Pack version or the Super Mario 3D All-Stars release. Both are solid options, especially if you use the wireless N64 controller. Emulation gives you higher resolutions, smoother performance, and tons of customization options, but it's not always a perfect experience, especially if you're using lower-end hardware. And of course, you need to provide your own ROM file to play. Then there's the PC port, which skips emulation entirely and runs Super Mario 64 natively with higher frame rates, widescreen support, improved controls, and even full graphical overhauls. If you want the game to look and feel as modern as possible, this is the way to go. So at the end of the day, the best way to play Super Mario 64 just depends on what you're after. Whether it's nostalgia, convenience, or modern upgrades, these days, there's an option that fits. Hopefully you found this video interesting, or at least got a new perspective on how to revisit Super Mario 64. Let me know in the comments which version you prefer, and if nothing else, maybe this made you rethink how you'd play it next time. Let me know. If you liked this video, make sure to hit the like button, and if not, hit the dislike button. And if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. I've also got a Patreon if you'd like to help support my work. Maybe one day I can make videos more often. Alright, well, that's it for me. Thanks for your time today, guys. Goodbye.